Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Beyond Terrain podcast. I am your host, Leah Dalton. If you're new around here, consider following the show or subscribing. And if you enjoy the show, leaving a review or a comment helps immensely. Best way to support the show, obviously, is by sharing. Your voice matters and spreading these ideas. And right now, we're actually building something extremely special, very close to my heart, the Beyond Terrain community. A place free from censorship, full of real, deep discussions rooted in true health, personal sovereignty. I really wanted to make this community the last stop. I'm sick of all these trends, these gurus, supplements, detox protocols. No more blind faith in systems that just don't serve us, whether they be modern or false alternative ones. This is just going to be real autonomy, real deep understanding, and the tools to reclaim your health and your life and that of your family as well. Right now, the waitlist is open. You can sign up to be a part of the movement. It's a great way to support the show while getting some value in return as well. So, without further ado, let's dive into today's episode. We have Dr. Barre Lando on today. Barre, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Honored to be with you. It's going to be fun. I'm looking forward to it.
Absolutely. Me too. Me too. So, the first question I ask all my guests, and I'm super eager to hear your response, is to get a little definition of health. What is health? What are we trying to achieve with health? How do we achieve it? How does it manifest? You can take it any direction that you'd like. I'll give you the floor and we'll take it from there.
Pretty simple. Health is a natural state of being. It's not the absence of anything. It's just what is.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we kind of like to reduce it to that absence, this negation of disease in some way. How do you think that affects the way you approach healing?
Well, first off, I really adhere to the principles, the old, the original Hippocrates oath in philosophy, which is one of the things is a doctor is supposed to be a teacher. And
Hmm.
what we are supposed to do is free the people that come to us for support from any false concepts that, in fact, create the absence of health,
Hmm.
or substitute, their natural state for something else. And health is freedom.
Yeah.
It's a realization of who we really are on the deepest level, and those limitations that we have superimposed on our terminologies within healthcare, things like disease and germs and all these connotations of a um, bioterrain, we'll call it, just our bodies being some kind of battlefield, is in fact the roots of all that ails us on this planet, the roots of war, you name it. If we cannot realize who we are and find peace within ourselves, and if we consider ourselves at war with our own biology or in fear of something might happen, some kind of flaw that we perceive or something attacking us, then we can't possibly achieve peace on a much larger scale.
Hmm. Yeah, very nice. I've noticed that you haven't used the terms biochemistry, molecular, chemical atoms, things like that when you're talking about health. Is that, you know, obviously we're in this system where that's sort of taught as the absolute basis of biology. You kind of view the body from a different perspective. Could I hear a little bit about how you even view our physical vessel?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not going into simulation, ideologies or anything, which some people, that go down that route, there's some truth to that, but it also suggests that maybe this is not important, this experience, this lifetime. And it's absolutely critical because we have a lot of stake when we choose on a soul level to embody, because it's an opportunity of many lifetimes. But in fact, there's really nothing physical about it in the way we think, which doesn't make it any less real, by the way. It becomes very challenging for me when I'm talking to people, and I've, had this thousands of times with every single client that, I've, taken care of, in that we have to sometimes use archaic language just to create a bridge of understanding. So we talk
Mhm.
about uh, all sorts of concepts within, the germ theory of disease. We have to use terminology sometimes that has to do with molecular biology, but in
Mhm.
fact, everything is a waveform, and a
Yeah,
waveform has a certain number of dimensions, and the dimensions, the attributes of each of those dimensions of a waveform give it a certain characteristic that takes on a certain appearance in the world that we live in, and then our senses pick up those waveforms and then interpret through our prior programming exactly what we visualize, what we hear, what we feel. So the greatest sages of all time came to that understanding and
mhm,
allowed them to see through the let's just say the superstition of materialism. And then more important was when that happens, then you're able to be master of your world, which is what we are here
yeah,
to learn how to do.
absolutely, and that's no small task. It's
But
quite an
it's an
amazing journey.
amazing adventure. Yeah, just exactly.
Yeah, yeah, amazing, definitely. So I'd kinda like to hear your thoughts, on, say, something like our genetics, right? Because I feel like this, these inheritance patterns and, sort of along the lines of the discussion of nature versus nurture when it comes to the manifestation of our psychological bodies, our spiritual bodies, and even our physical manifestations. Um, is there some truth to this whole genetic idea where we have stuff in us that sort of dictates our health or who we are, or is it more along the lines of this energetical realm and the environment afterwards has more to do with the state of who we are than what we're born with? Is that clear?
Yeah, absolutely. What I think you're referring to is genetic determinism. Any
Yeah.
kind of determinism, whether it's genetics or astrology, thinking that we're a victim of the stars that we were born under, we have to understand certain influences, but also understand that we are to master all of that. So, genetics, you have to, definitely, within the field of uh, technological and what we consider scientific fields, they isolate certain things that, can actually sometimes be observable. Sometimes they have to be conjectured about or theorized, and the latter is more true in most
Yeah.
cases. And genetics is no exception. But what we have to appreciate is that what we isolate as the building blocks of genetics are done out of living structures. In other words, they're isolated from the living whole. And just like anything that is, isolated and brought out into an external environment, then it's going to take on different characteristics. And then all we can do is theorize about it because we cannot see it in vivo. In other words, within a living consciousness, not just a living biology, but a living consciousness. So
Mhm.
and my firm opinion is that what we consider DNA are actual, it's an encoded um, light. Um, and light, I'm not
Wow.
talking about particles like photons, but waveforms, again, of certain characteristics that embody all the experience that we have ever put into motion. And that
Wow.
does have a great influence on certain habitual things that might be visualized occurring between family members, even certain maladies that we might call disease and things. But when we understand the true nature of DNA or genetics, then we understand it's a product of our consciousness. And anytime, again, we come to that greater state of awareness, we can change it. And the wonderful thing is that when any individual within, let's say, a genetic lineage grows that awareness, then it frees everybody before and after.
Wow. Yeah, quite the power in that.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, amazing. You know, we talk a lot about, some of the methods used in the modern scientific lab, and some of the problems associated with them, obviously in the empirical tradition. uh, Say something like, taking a cell and blending it and then centrifuging it and adding a bunch of chemicals and then getting this precipitate and calling it DNA, right? So,
Exactly.
for example, another example is something like electron microscopy, where you have to freeze it, stain it with heavy metals, you have to dehydrate and rehydrate it with some sort of chemical gel, and all of these different steps that are used in these techniques, and then we call it empiricism. it, is there any validity to some of these techniques that are being used in the lab today? Because I know you spend a lot of time in the lab, but you certainly take the alchemical tradition of lab work rather than this modern, super materialistic way of looking at things. Is there validity in some of these techniques that we're using nowadays in the modern lab?
I think there's some validity, and I'll isolate this to medicine because that's my wheelhouse. Um,
Sure.
and also, I practice on the conventional side. I was in emergency medical services before
Yeah.
started looking into other areas. And so when we would take labs to, certain, determine if certain assays are up, or, blood values for certain elements, it gave us clues on how to keep the body alive. And so
Sure.
I think in certain circumstances with urgent care medicine, when it's life and death situations or critical care units, yeah, there's some value in that. The problem is we extrapolate that or use it as a showcase, so to speak, to apply to all the vast other areas of medicine. And urgent care is just a fraction of the conventional medical field, but it's all based on a trust system of what we do in urgent care, which is spectacular. We brought a lot of folks back, without heartbeat and so forth,
Yeah.
blood loss and hypovolemic and, all the things that would kill them. And here's the thing, too. Um, this is a note to all the urgent care practitioners out there. I think, we used to do some sort of heroic things. However, the life or death of that individual we were working with was not up to us. We did mechanical things, but on another level, it wasn't their time. And so
Mhm.
they had a near death experience for a reason. And I think we were useful tools to help them stay within their body if their creator presence, whatever you want to refer it to, had more work for them to do within this realm. So even within that realm of urgent care, we can't get too full of ourselves. But to answer your question, yeah, I see some value. But the rest of medicine, which is, I don't know how to put a percentage, probably like 95% of,
Sure.
all the other kind of healthcare, no, it leads us astray more than not. And it actually leads us away from our true selves. And it's very disempowering, even though it's disempowering because it feeds our misconceptions, our anxieties, and that I think that's great detriment.
Sure. Sure. No, very well put, and I completely agree. And I've thought about that a lot. This whole idea of modern medicine, or emergency medicine. Sorry, kind of bringing people back from, after their near death experiences. And I really, really do appreciate your take, because I've come to kind of a similar conclusion. Like, I thought initially, I was like, are we interfering with sort of the creators, what they want, right? With the path that was set for us. Are we interfering with that? But like you said, the creator uses all of creation as a tool, and so obviously it wasn't necessarily these individuals' time to move on. And so I do really appreciate that perspective. And I suppose, you know, I think where the real problem comes with when I was asking that earlier question, is in sort of the theoretical side of things, like how we conceptualize the body itself. How do we understand what our body is? How does it function? How does it work? And you brought up Hippocrates earlier. So in university, I took a introduction. What was it? It was introduction. Sorry, it was history of modern medicine, birth of the body, and it was a class centered around Hippocrates' teachings. And we went way back, 500 BC, and talked about Hippocrates and his work. We talked about Galen, and we talked about all these guys. And it was really interesting taking this course. It was one of the best university courses I took because of the professor. He made it definitely what it was. Um, a lot of the
Sorry,
questions remained
you just
unanswered
broke
in
up
this
a little
day and
bit,
age.
so I didn't hear, about 20 seconds of that.
Okay, no problem. Just my the history, birth of the body course surrounding Hippocrates. You know, we were talking about a lot of these topics that remain unanswered. Like back in the day, they didn't dissect individuals after they passed, right? So they didn't know about our anatomy because they said a dead body is not going to act like a live body. So why would we cut a dead person open to see how the body works, right? And I was like, I raised my hand and I was like, how do we know that's true today? Like, how have we answered this question? Can we actually answer this question? And, it spurred on this great discussion in the class. But, so many of these original teachings and assumptions are still not known today. We run on so many assumptions in sort of this modern way of conceptualizing the body. And obviously, one of the biggest assumptions is that we are just material and we are, chemicals, and we have these biochemical reactions. That's certainly the foundation of what's being taught today. And I suppose a lot of these techniques, especially when it comes to anatomy, like we look at Harold Hillman's work, with electron microscopy, disproving this idea of a lot of these cellular superstructures that we understand, ribosomes, cell membranes, even something like the synapse in our neural system. We have no clue about the real anatomy of the body. So I'm kind of just curious from your perspective. You obviously take this, you know, much different view of the internal workings, as we pointed out earlier. How do you go about learning a better representation of the body rather than this materialistic, worldview that we take, in academia nowadays?
Yeah. I don't like to throw the baby out with the bathwater on either side.
Sure.
When I had to do dissection, in a regular 4-year, medical curriculum, and I had to do 3 times conventional, naturopathic 4-year college, and chiropractic college, and so
Wow.
first year of each one, we did a full dissection. You're given a body, and that's your material for the full 2 semesters for the year, and you pick it
Wow.
apart, piece by piece. Now, I thought that was absolutely ghoulish, and there's part of me that didn't like it at all. And then on the other hand, it does help you understand structure, but it does not teach you how those work in a living system. So
Yeah.
there's some value, and then also on a conventional side, if you stop there, then you think that's the way things really work. For example, in conventional medical science, they say that after a certain age, your cranial bones fuse at the sutures. There's many sutures in your head, and
Yeah.
any craniopath worth his salt trains themselves how to feel the movement. There's distinct movement. So the
Yeah.
reason why they believe sutures ossify and there's no movement is because they see that on cadavers. And that's true
Sure.
on cadavers. There was an Italian segment of the medical field over there that did studies in different ways and said, no, actually, the cranial bones are moving all the time. And if they didn't, you'd be dead. So,
Wow.
that's just a simple example. But as far as the real morphology of the human body, what has been helpful to me was to go deeply into the old alchemical schools. Now,
Yeah.
when we say alchemical, for folks that are not familiar or have an appreciation for what that really is, just think of all chemistry, not just the end products of waveforms that you see in a lab or in traditional science, but you're actually seeing both sides of the equation. You're seeing the energetic principles that actually create those after effects. And the value, of course, is you then understand how the universe works and therefore how you work and what your potentials are. So, in the alchemical sciences, you understand the etheric mechanisms. And those etheric mechanisms have a very define function according to those stratifications. So I'm kind of making it a little materialistic here, but just to talk about it.
Sure.
And at each one of those levels, certain things happen. Things happen that can even be understood from a Western perspective. We can assign instead of the old alchemical, fire, water, air, salt, all that kind of stuff, earth. We can confine it or use molecular terminologies, like hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, and carbon. But at each one of those, we can then demonstrate, even for the satisfaction of our Western brains, how certain things happen, how initial idea or consciousness, that fire element, that is represented by hydrogen, within our Western concept. And then things coagulate, and then nitrogen, the next level down, which would be air in the old, system of thinking. And we can
Mhm.
even look outside, in nature and see how when nitrogen increases in the atmosphere, like when things are getting cold, then it increases the viscosity of the sap in trees and cuts off that lifeblood to the outer branches and leaves
Yeah.
wither and die. And so all these principles are demonstrated to us all around. And then the next level, the transmitting utility, when water, there's a fermentation process. And in the alchemical lab, fermentation means you're actually separating the parts. You're now identifying the three components that compose all life forms that are a product of those four stratifications. The fourth one is what we consider the carbon or the earth realm, where things actually precipitate into the full after effects that we perceive as real. But those four, and we won't go into detail on how, but each
Mhm.
level or combination of levels creates one of the three attributes. And what I'm getting at too is the actual structure or anatomy of the body. And in
Yeah.
the alchemical terms, they talk about mercury as kind of that prana, chi, spirit that moves through all things kind of thing. And then we have the salt, which is the calcification, the body. And then we have the sulfur, which is the individualized soul. Now, if you get into Steiner's work a little bit, and I don't, I learn from wherever I can, but I try not to just become a zealot for any one school of thought, but Steiner had a lot of good stuff. And what he understood, him and Goethe, is the metamorphosis of the body from those stratifications. And they can identify those three alchemical divisions into parts of the body. For instance, the sulfur is the metabolism. It's the soul is the metabolism, the thing that actually individualizes and makes things work, makes energy, what we would think of in biology. The salt is actually the part of the neurology and the neurology, and we could talk at length about each of these. And then
Yeah.
the other part, the extremities, is kind of the spirit, because that's what ambulates us. It's moving, and it's
Yeah,
how we
yeah.
exercise our will form. So when I'm practicing medicine, I look at the body in those compartments. I look at it as a whole, but I also understand manifestations of, let's just say, the lack of health. You can start pinpointing on what of those three components really needs attention, and start coming up with more solutions that way. You can even take those three divisions down to the microbial level, because it
Yeah.
never stops. and down to the
Absolutely.
elements, the the metallic elements we think of as minerals that are the capacitors that hold the resonance that then our cells get their information from to build the body in the first place. So
Hmm.
it's a much deeper understanding. It's living, but you may not be able to see that in a conventional laboratory or under a microscope, but you can demonstrate those functional principles in medicine or in a different kind of laboratory where you're making preparations from minerals. And I can, I which I've done, is I take rainwater, filter it, and end up making 12 different components, nothing added, nothing subtracted. It's just the same original water, and each one of them has different attributes that you can actually measure. How does that
Wow.
happen? That's called transmutation, and the law of transmutation is what makes us tick. It's what the old alchemist understood. And then when we get into waveform mechanics, we can start to westernize it a little bit as far as understanding how those waveforms are associated with every single one of those processes, and how, in fact, we're the originator of that initial idea or spark that created the electricity, that polarized it, went all the way down to the stratification in the first place.
Yeah, amazing. That's one of the things that you do so well is you can really bridge these teachings that have been around for thousands of years with the modern way of sort of even speaking about something to make it, kind of clear to understand. So I really appreciate that. And if that doesn't get you excited to learn about alchemy, I don't know what will. I'm like, I gotta go read some more books here on alchemy because that's something I've kind of been neglecting a little bit here in my study. But one of the hot topics, and you brought it up briefly, is the microbial system. And I would love to talk about it because I do think that this is one of the areas that our modern techniques that doesn't allow us to see the pleomorphic nature of microbes because we're not
Mhm.
looking at our microsystems in live states. Obviously, we have like a dark field microscope that allows us to really see the pleomorphic
Mhm.
nature of microbes, but obviously these are not in the laboratory either in any academic institution that I know of. At least you might know of a couple hidden ones around the place, but yeah, usually not. Usually they're still working within the framework of dead matter, stains, heavy metals, different things like that. I'd love to maybe just hear your thoughts on what pleomorphism is to begin with, and maybe any points about our microbial system, and then we could probably move into a little bit deeper of a discussion on that topic.
Yeah, pleomorphism is simply the law of transmutation in action. And
Yeah,
there's nothing that escapes those cyclic changes that happen in the world of appearances. So it brings up another point. When we are looking at things more mechanistically, then we like to say that's the way it is. We like to fixate on certain isolated things and say that's a fact. Well, in fact, if you stood around and watched a certain mineral for a few thousand years, you might see one element change into an entirely different element on the periodic table. Of course, you're not going to do that by watching it on a tabletop somewhere. You have to get inside the living body of the earth that
sure.
has its own consciousness and faculties that create that effect. So things are always in flux, including ours, our own bodies. I look a lot different than I used to, 50 years ago. Um, so everything is about change. Now, when it comes to microbes, there are certain innate organisms that live within us. And we aren't going into Darwinian evolution here. That's a different kind of thing. But we have evolved I like to say expanded. Evolved suggests sort of a linear progression,
Yeah,
whereas evolution should be thought as more of a multidimensional expansion. But we'll
love
use
it.
evolution for the heck of it. As we evolve, certain organisms, microorganisms, have evolved with us. Now, we were talking about the three divisions of the body that Steiner talked about, and what I recognize the way I work. Each one of those has a different germ layer of tissue. That I'm not talking about microbes, but the germ layers. For instance, that ambulation part that we're likening to the mercury, that is the mesoderm, the stuff that makes the muscles that make things move and so forth. And with the mesoderm, certain microbes that have an affinity for doing special work within those tissues that would evolve into our body parts later on, they evolve with it and become our permanent eco partners. The same thing, the ectoderm that makes the nervous system tissue, different types of little micro creatures, again, that become the ecobionts or partners of that tissue. And therefore, for the life of our body, the organs and tissues that evolve from that germ level. And then the endoderm that has more to do with our organs. And I'm just simplifying because there's overlap and stuff. Similarly has its own little partners on the microbial level that develop with it. Now,
Mhm.
so the reason for that is because those microbes are the little worker bees, and they are going to, for the life of the body, and let me just say something else beyond the life of the body, because those are living sentient beings that are peopling our own universe that we are the god of.
Yeah.
So don't think that their journey stops when we change bodies. They move on as we do, and there's a whole evolutionary process and opportunity for the expansion of their awareness as well. Um,
Wow.
so there's a whole psychic life of microbes that goes along with this that goes a little deeper. But now, those microorganisms, when there's a certain issue in the body, for instance, something needs to regenerate or
Mhm.
something needs to be cleaned up, maybe some old spent tissues or toxicities, then they will change into different life cycles that will act as a scavenger. Now, before when we were talking off air, you brought up Gaston Naissance, and
Yeah.
not just with him, but also with people that predated him, Gunther Enderlein, notably.
Fine.
They identified 16 life cycle stages that would go from little seed forms that, very, very tiny. They look like little sparkling lights darting around under a live cell microscope slide, which I used extensively for many years.
Yeah.
Looked at the blood of everybody. I didn't jump to conclusions just with what I saw there, but it was a very important tool. And then you would
Yeah.
see right before your eyes from that stage, which would be, maybe about zero point 0.5 micron size, which is interestingly the proximate size of what conventional medicine considers a virus. Um,
Yeah.
Enough on that. But then you would see them go through stages where two would come together and then a membrane forms. And then, you see a little head on each side of this membrane. And then all of a sudden it coalesces into a singular kind of like little creepy crawler worm like thing that's swimming around. We call that a chondrite. And then from there, different formations until you get up into higher valences. And now all of a sudden you see what conventional science, what I learned in medicine, as the three types of bacteria. And then
Mhm.
beyond that, they would start growing branches and look like fungus. But each one of those stages, the important takeaway is they have a certain function at each of those stages. So that is pleomorphism. Now, besides just looking at those three germ layers and the microbes that evolve with those to be permanent helpers with us, because they have an affinity, then there are also categorizations, we'll say, according to traditional pleomorphism of different kind of organisms that will also have an affinity for different types of tissues in the body, like Aspergillus niger, one of our
Yeah.
little partners in there. has important functions for the lymphatic system and the lungs, and mucorracimosis for the cardiovascular system, candida parasilosis for the gut, and all the oral cavity, and so on and so forth. And so in medicine, you can use that to great advantage in a number of ways. I'll just stop there, and you kind
Sure.
of get me
Yeah.
back on the tracks.
No, no, that's perfect. One thing I was kind of curious about, uh, you know, was the role of parasites. We kind of come from the idea that parasites, again, don't cause disease. They still have this bioremediary role. They can still help maybe in the very late stages of disease at some points. Do they fit into pleomorphism? Like, I was curious if that was something that you ever saw like in the later stages, maybe even past the fungal stage. I'm just kind of curious if you've ever encountered that.
Yeah, absolutely. Parasites go through cyclic changes as well. They have an important function. If an animal dies out in the forest here, surrounding our farm, they're on the spot and they gobble things up and clean up the forest floor. And it's an important function. They do the same thing in your body. We all have parasites, but they only become problematic when our bioterrain becomes askew, becomes out of balance. Then they're not out of any pathogenic tendency trying to harm us, but they're opportunistically multiplying, growing in size, and doing what they do because there's a lot of stuff to gobble up, maybe in a toxic environment. And they are just acting as scavengers, and they're saying, "Thank you very much. There's a lot to sustain ourselves with here." So I would use occasionally antiparasitics for this reason. If somebody was coming in with and again, I have to use conventional terminologies, end stage cancer, which we'll just say it for now. And but they're literally on the ropes. They're not going to be in their body, and that's the reality. That's what I used to see all the time. So very often in that state, the body also had outgrowths of microorganism imbalances and parasitic imbalances. So, if I were to just do a very judicious um, little cycle of an antiparasitic, which I would favor something like frequencies, sometimes I would use chemical means like very pure grade of turpentine. Uh,
Okay.
People that are into turpentine tend to go off the deep end and say it's for whatever ails you. But I had a way to very carefully monitor the body so I wouldn't overstay my welcome because there can, it's
Sure.
a little bit harsh in other ways. But I would knock down the populations of, say, a parasite because they're excreting their own waste products in the blood, not helping anything at that point. Again, not their fault, and also gobbling up a lot of nutrition. So that would help me create a little
Sure.
window of opportunity just to allow people to get a little bit more wind back in their sails, and then other things would work better. And there's, with this whole scam that happened, in the last few years, there's something that became very popular. Am I allowed to say medicines and things? And
Say it. Yeah. Big old
ivermectin.
ivermectin.
And so, it helps a lot of people for the same reason, but there's a
Yeah.
great toll on the back end. It
Hmm.
sterilizes a lot of the populations, just like antibiotics do, of very beneficial and necessary organisms that you need later on. And now you leave yourself open, to other things. And of course, they think they're curing COVID, which doesn't exist the way they think it does. And,
Mhm.
but, some people say, "Hey, I feel better." And all that tells me is, oh, okay, your system was out of balance in the first place, which is why you're taking that stuff, but it's working. You're going to have a price to pay on the back end, and it's not working for the reasons why you think it's working. And if you
Sure.
really wanted to play that game, then you should maybe take a little round of turpentine instead. It's going to be a lot healthier for you.
True. True. Absolutely.
Um, and the same thing with the microorganisms that are innate to our system, some of those ones that I alluded to. Now, when they go into these higher valences because they have a job to do, maybe a scavenger kind of job or something, but we fail to support them in the job they're doing, then you get in sort of a hanging conflict where they to overstay their welcome. Again, not because they're pathogens, like one particular progression into a bacterial form we might recognize as Staphylococcus, which is an outgrowth of something that actually is a seed living in us and is very beneficial. It's there doing the job. On the other hand, it doesn't go away because it can't complete its job because the biotrain is out of whack and we are failing to support it, and then
Interesting.
so I might go in with isopathics of a certain type or other remedies and just sort of corral that in, but not to kill it, but to um, down regulate it into the forms that aren't going to, be posing a stress. And then, of course, take care of the reason why they're overstaying their welcome in the first place.
Sure. Sure. Very well put. I'm curious if you could comment on penicillin, right? Because the original discovery, might fit into this conversation and how it's used today. I'm just kind of curious about your thoughts on that. I don't know too much about it, so I'm really eager to hear what you have to say about it.
So, first off, I'll throw the conventional medical system a bone
Yeah.
and I'll say, if a person is so far gone where systemically uh, these organisms, again, not because they're causal or pathogens, but are creating such havoc and there's not enough time, or let's just say you're not with a biotrained physician, you're on that other side. Things can get a little bit out of hand and you can have a systemic sepsis, and antibiotics in that level can be life saving. It's
Absolutely.
stupid, because you're using them. It's like going in rather than having normal relationships with your neighbor, you just go over and nuke them. Um, but it works.
You're not addressing the root cause, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, but here's the other side, which far outweighs, the benefits. So the
Yeah.
folks that live in different worlds and aren't, really willing to take responsibility, okay, use them, but it's going to take its toll. And here's how it happens. A tumor, we'll call a tumor. Um, it's a biological expression
Mhm.
and it is for our benefit. And we could go on many levels of biology, um, all the way to the level of our psyche on how
Yeah.
that tumor actually is designed to help us. And it will also go through a two-phase predictable life cycle of its own. And if we are able to support what it's doing for us to heal us, it will go away. Now, in
Mhm.
the end stage, we're talking about a growth. There's different kinds of organisms that get active in the first stage, and it gets a little bit more complex that way, but we'll just keep it simple. And the ones that work on the second phase on a growth in the body, um, when the biological expression is first initiated, those organisms that are going to be needed in that second stage are already there with the process. They're waiting. It's how the body works, and that's why embryologically certain organisms, uh, you know, align with certain tissues. And when a tissue makes a move in some level, those organisms are right with it. They're inseparable.
Yeah.
And now, when that tumor has done its job, then those organisms are going to transmutate into a scavenger form and they're going to gobble up the tissue that is no longer necessary and it's going to
Yeah.
go away. And in fact, that happens all the time in our bodies and we don't even know it. Things are coming and going. And that's why sometimes, well, maybe early detection, good idea or not. I don't know. Um, yeah, we don't even know it. But however, when it
Mhm.
gets into a hanging conflict, because maybe That second stage can't resolve, and the tumor can't be digested properly because we overused antibiotics at some point in our life and sterilized those organisms that are needed to scavenge. You got problems. In fact, I would say that antibiotics are one of the main contributors of what we consider um, cancer that is reticent to any kind of treatment.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Since you brought it up, I do want to talk about viruses for a few moments. Obviously, this is a hot topic. Do like there's a lot of talk about, the actual existence of these particles, whether they're just laboratory artifacts. Obviously, using a dark field microscope, you could see at the scale that these, little dots exist, right?
Mhm.
What's your take? Do viruses exist? They might probably don't exist in the way that we think of them in our Western way, but what is your take on the virus? Does the particle exist? What role does it play? How would you even go about talking about what we think is a virus?
So the particles, number one, aren't isolated in a
Yeah,
way that can soundly be recognized to match the virus theory.
sure.
And ribosomes, which are another little organ within cells, um, they also can fit the bill of that size of, what we
Sure.
think of as virus.
Yeah.
First off, viruses as pathogens, you have to go into a different mode of thinking, which is natural design inherently damages and destroys. Now, there are factions of the natural design that maintain balance, just like a mom and dad in a family. Dad might kind of set some guidelines in a certain way, and then mom might,
Yeah.
provide more than nurturing. And what we were describing with the microbes that live within us, they do that too. Some digest materials, eat up stuff, and others nurture and, stimulate stem cell production and so forth and help things regenerate. So it's about an ecosystem that's self perpetuating and self renewing. Whereas when you go into the conventional medical side, it's just these things that are destroying. And in order to help you, you have to destroy the things that destroys you. And that gets into the whole immunization and immunology mode of thinking. And the immune system is also a fallacy. When you look at components of the immune system, like antibodies and so forth, well, all antibodies are doing is stimulating regenerating processes. That brings us to why I believe there's no such thing as a viral pathogen. And
Mhm.
my eyes really opened in the early 80s when I started getting a lot of AIDS people,
Yeah.
um, people that
Mhm.
were diagnosed with AIDS. And of course, the AIDS was considered a uh, product of HIV. And for HIV, we had an antibody test. Now, the antibody test was capable of determining that there was a certain titer of a certain kind of antibody.
Mhm.
So, and again, antibodies aren't there to fight bad guys, they are part of our self renewal system.
Mhm.
So they had to create a nexus. Dr. Fauci was at the heart of this, by the way.
Yeah.
And so they have to have a viral theory. And then they also have to have a theory that there's a link between rising titers of this antibody. And this antibody that would rise in amounts in the body that you could test was a
Yeah.
result of the body healing itself. And it didn't have anything to do with a virus or something called AIDS. We know how AIDS started. It was a bioweapon. It was downloaded into smallpox vaccines and experimented on extensively in East Africa. and it worked. People just got all these outgrowths of all the stuff we consider
Yeah.
AIDS. And then they say, okay, great success. And then they brought it to the East Coast and used the gay populations as a vulnerable population to create the
Mhm.
mythology and put the same elements in hepatitis vaccines. Said you guys are all prone to this because of your lifestyle and stuff, and then took it to San Francisco, and that was the beginning of the whole AIDS thing. But then uh, they perpetuated it by not uh, you didn't after the whole disease was considered a fact, and here's how it happens. Now the final 1-2 punch was which the HIV cocktails, the AZT and so forth, which would kill you. Okay,
Yeah.
so here's how I kind of connected some dots. Can I prove it? But I saw hundreds of AIDS patients, hundreds, and the vast majority all got better,
Yeah.
even in ones who were very advanced, and nothing to do with me. I was just kind of getting a little savvy about what was going on, and
Yeah.
maybe that the meds weren't a good idea, and then also rebuilding their terrain. So
Sure.
when these people came in with the diagnosis, that titer of HIV may or may not go down as they were actually getting better. So I'm like, okay, they're free of symptoms, and all by the checks that I do, to just determine if the terrain is healthy. They're pretty good shape, but they might still have, positive tests. So what's that test, that antibody test actually telling me? Now, I saw the same thing with Epstein-Barr, um, hepatitis C, all these so-called, you know, viral etiologies and antibody associated. And it was true across the board with all these things. So, just anybody that's capable of taking care of the body properly in an aggressive way and then also observing, you're like, there doesn't seem to be a correlation between the reason why they diagnose this and then blame the systems on the thing that they use for the diagnosis.
Yeah.
I think there's some reality to that. And then,
Sure.
beyond that, I'm very practical. I'm a farmer. So they're, great intellectual minds, that really like to get in and read all the research in the papers. And they can talk circles around me, as far as, all the studies and research. Um,
Yeah.
I'm not so much interested. I just want to know what works. And I think real intelligence, there's a place for that other stuff, but real intelligence is just, common sense.
Mhm.
So I was able to just watch, observe what happens when you do things and don't do other things.
Yeah.
And now, one of the tests that I did, and I'll finish up with this, sorry. Um,
Okay.
I did certain kinds of blood tests on my own in-house and didn't send out for conventional. But if people came in with, blood tests from elsewhere, I actually interpreted them a little bit differently, but I learned some things, not all a
Sure.
wash. But the ones I did, I was able to extrapolate the elements I would pull out of bodily fluids and put it in an electrical kind of format. And I use mathematics to do that. It would give me what we call the line of resistance because the body's electrical. That had much more import and practical function for me. But the point I'm trying to make is one of the components of that test is I had to visualize cell debris. And cell debris is something that is just what the name implies. Cells are dying and being renewed every single moment. Now, when the debris is of a high titer that is abnormally high, which means there's a lot of cell damage for some reason, then that cell debris is in those little small micron, possibly confused with virus, theory. And those cell debris are actually beneficial in that they carry bits of information that stimulate the production of exosomes, endosomes, that start manufacturing goodies, including antibodies. They stimulate stem cell growth and things that are part of the renewal process. So even when
Okay.
the body has a lot of circulating cell fragments from spent cells, they're still doing a function.
Mhm.
But when it was of a certain level, that also suggested that that terrain's a little burdened, and it also coincided with very often when people had symptoms that were confused with a virus etiology.
Gotcha. Is there ever any confusion of like a viral particle with the microzyma or with the somatid, protist, whatever you want to, endobiont? Is there ever any confusion between that particle and, that basis of, the pleomorphic cycle?
I believe so. I don't know for sure, but my
Yeah.
best guess is absolutely. Again, when they are visualizing with their kinds of technology, they are not seeing things in a living state.
Mhm.
So they can observe things of a certain size in abundance when certain symptoms correlate and, maybe could be confused with their viral theory.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I've heard that Nasons was able to isolate the somatid and work with it. And obviously, Antoine Béchat did some experiments with fermentation using he called them the microzymas. I don't know if Béchat had the isolate or whether he just visualized it and saw, one of these jars had the microzyma and the other one didn't. And that's how he was able to determine his results. Now, is there any truth to that being able to isolate the somatid?
Yeah, I believe that's what we observed all the time. And
Yeah,
also thought of as the seed of life
yeah,
within the body. And then you have people like Wilhelm Reich with his experiments that really identified these bions with these little blue auras around them that
yeah.
were the source of all life, the seeds of all life. That's how our
Amazing.
body starts. Our
Yeah,
body starts at the moment of conception with a seed atom, it's called, for lack of a better terminology. That's kind of
sure.
old school. That seed atom is the Akashic record of our soul and all of our prior experiences that will then create a portal, in which case those waveforms will again manifest into a living being with all the beneficial and flawed um, waveforms that we created through our own prior experience. It is our job now to put right. But if you look at an acorn, the acorn doesn't turn into a large oak tree because all of the elements are in the acorn. It's the informational fields for the entire tree that other levels of the ether will then be able to download all of the things for the lifetime of that tree so it manifests into a tree. Same thing as our body. So is that seed atom the primordial bion, so to speak? A lot to think about. I don't have all the answers, but
Definitely.
it's kind of fun.
Absolutely. I like thinking about this stuff too. And I think that's a really amazing point you made. The acorn, and it showcases sort of the role of the environment too, because the acorn can't grow up in the Arctic. It needs the right environment to manifest as well.
And just like we embody into the perfect circumstances we need in order to fulfill our mission as an expanding consciousness on the soul level.
Wow. Beautiful. Well, Dr. Lando, I think this is probably a great time to wrap things up. I feel like we did a little bit of a beautiful cycle there in and of itself. So I'd love to ask for any final thoughts on the episode, anything that you want to leave the listener with. Now's the time.
No, I think it was a fun discussion, and I think you did a great job just kind of leading it there because I can go off on tangents if I'm not careful. But no, it was great, and The only thing I'd like to maybe leave your audience with is, we threw out maybe some unfamiliar terminologies. Your audience is probably pretty sophisticated, I would imagine. But
Oh, they're
still,
great.
all this stuff is not rocket science. And everything
Yeah.
that I speak on can be demonstrated in the farm, in the laboratory, in the human body, in the practice of medicine. And it's way more common sense, logical, and simplified than everything I had to learn in medical school, which leads to nothing
Yeah.
but blind end theories and
Yeah.
disease and death, basically.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. Wow. That's great. And Dr. Lando, where can the listeners learn more from you? You obviously have an amazing podcast that you co-host with. We just had Mike Winter on actually not too many episodes ago. So
Oh, okay.
maybe you could tell them about that, any websites or social medias, anything like that.
Well, just, I'm not, I participate in the podcast. I'm really not a podcaster. Mike kind of ropes me into that one. But it's great fun. We meet a lot of great folks like yourself. The website is alphavedic.com, ALFAVEDIC.
Yeah.
That's where you find all our stuff. I'm making things in my lab all the time, and we have a permaculture farm. And part of our permaculture operation is to fund ourselves by making stuff out of what we grow, and then ingredients that we can procure elsewhere from trusted partners and things. So it's kind of a hobby for me, really not it's more of a lifestyle. So
Sure.
alphavedic.com. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, we'll put the links down below. And thank God for Mike for roping you into that because you've obviously shared so much invaluable wisdom with everyone. And it's really amazing thing that you have everything that you have to share. So really, I appreciate your time. I appreciate all the wisdom that you've shared with us today. Thank you so much, Dr.
Thank
Lando.
you for having me.
Certainly. All right, and I want to thank you all for listening. Just quick reminder that this is not medical advice or any advice for that matter. This is for your informational purposes only. That being said, you are a sovereign being capable of thinking, criticizing, questioning, understanding absolutely anything. We in the greater forces are together self healers, self governable, self teachers, and so much more. And this is why the Beyond Terrain community exists. This is why I'm so passionate about it. We are done chasing trends, supplements, magic bullets, victim mindsets. We're leaving all of this in the past. If you're ready to take full responsibility, build true resilience, and gain wisdom to navigate the health and life that you want independently, this is the place for you. Right now, the waitlist is open. Make sure to get in early to lock in that low price. Founding members have lots of perks and benefits. So make sure you go check that out over on the website. Links are all down below, of course. If you have any questions, criticisms, comments, or whatever about the episode today, please reach out on Instagram, beyond.terrain. You know where to find me. Listen, I really appreciate every single one of you for taking the time to listen. If you found the episode valuable in any way, please like, share, and support the podcast. Leave us a review or a rating. Goes a long way on the podcasting apps as well. And just remember, there are two types of people in the world: those believe they can, those believe they can't, and they are both correct. So make sure to choose wisely. Thanks for listening, guys. Take care.